Welcome, everyone, to the Backlight Podcast, Episode 2. I'm your host, Patrick Farrell, and I'm joined with my co-host, Michael Sorpa.
What's happening, everyone?
Yes. What is happening, everyone? I would love to see the comments, but we haven't posted the first episode yet, so we'll just be backlogging that for a little while. Not to worry, we will get to them. So last week we talked a lot about Extraction. We talked a lot about kind of action in film. And this week, we are going to take a look at one of our favorite directors, Denis Villenueve, and kind of get a really good insight into one of our favorite films from him, which is Prisoners. But before we get to that, Mike, what have you been watching and absorbing recently?
I actually took a little bit of time to rewatch The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. And I remember on first watch, I saw that in theaters, and I was very off-put by what that movie was and couldn't figure it out, couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Went home, did a lot of research, and found out the underlying subtext and the Promethean storyline and everything like that. And so I went back and rewatched it, and it's actually surprisingly a good movie. Like, I really enjoyed it on second watch, where I really didn't enjoy it on first watch.
Yeah.
I really liked it when I watched it.
That's good.
I also noticed that, and this is something that I know as a cinematographer, but something I haven't really ever seen before. Black and white film, when it's projected, is blue.
Oh, yeah.
But
I remember you telling me
when
about
it's
that, yeah.
digitally composed, it actually has like a warmer tone to it. And so when I first saw it, I had seen coming attractions, I had seen trailers like on Instagram and YouTube and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it looked very black and white and very warm. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. And when I went to the theater, it was blue and it gave it a totally different feeling. So when I watched it actually on a digital screen, not projected, it had that warmer tone and it felt entirely different than when I watched it in the theater.
Yeah.
Theater viewing experience was definitely better. But in terms of like getting the story and understanding what I was actually watching, definitely loved watching it in a nice living room setting on a TV. It was definitely a really, really, really good second watch.
Very good.
What have you been watching, sir?
Let me think. I watched Jojo Rabbit recently. I rewatched that. Very good
Fantastic
film.
movie.
Yep.
Fantastic movie.
I rewatched Prisoners, obviously, and we'll get to that. And then I've been watching some series. I've been watching Last Kingdom. Been watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine because I love that show. But one of the movies that I watched that I haven't seen before was The Farewell. It was for those of you who haven't listened to our first episode, I told everyone, demanded the population of our listeners to go out and educate themselves and listen and watch and absorb some foreign media. Yes, I said
specifically listen to.
Yeah, specifically.
That's the best part.
Just go and watch a movie, but cover your eyes the entire time.
We've been having this running joke, sorry to cut you off, before every podcast, where we talk about what would happen if we did this podcast, but left the movie running in the background, but exclusively talked about the visual elements.
Oh, God.
So, yes, when you watch a movie, go and listen to it. Don't actually watch it, because then I want to know what the experience is like if we were to do that for the podcast. Okay, continue, sorry.
You're good. But The Farewell, it was a really good movie. Like, I would say it didn't impact me cinematically the same way that Parasite did. But it's like a wholly different film experience, It's definitely a small piece of realism. The best comparison point is it's an actually good Crazy Rich Asians, but it's not about rich people, and it doesn't just like see Asian people as like this very, very stereotypical, especially with the Chinese, it doesn't see them as like this very strict people. There's so many tender moments in the film, and there's some really funny moments in the film. I would say it's because it's genred as a comedy drama. I'd say it's definitely more of a drama than a comedy. But it's beautifully shot. It feels so simple and so endearing the way it's filmed. It's nothing extravagant. I love the score. I don't know what it is with composers from China. I guess it's just because their culture, they're still kind of like stuck in that, like, and even in Korea, they're still stuck in that kind of neoclassical period. And so, that's why Parasite, sounds so much like Haydn and so much like Vivaldi. And then you have The Farewell, which emulated a lot of that. It's just a nice, simple score. And then big props. And I don't know why she wasn't nominated or won or just more recognized. Awkwafina was so great in that film.
Yeah, I hear a lot of good things about Awkwafina in that movie.
She was just so relatable as a character. Like she's just this college student living in New York, and then her grandma is given this terminal diagnosis, but the Chinese don't tell them about it. Their family, the entire family, it's like a cultural tradition, and so they all go, and it's. She's just like, like, I'm in perfectly good health, and they're all just like super sad because they're like, you're gonna die in a couple days. And it's like such a great premise. I think it was Lulu Wang who directed it. She did a phenomenal job. Super great movie, highly recommend. But that's what I've been absorbing. And I think that actually segues into kind of the first question that I have for you, Mike. And I think this is going to segue into Villeneuve pretty well, coming from The Farewell. It's what do films need to do to keep the audience interested?
Wow, that's a really deep question to start off on.
And I'm not.
It has so many facets to it.
Yeah, and I'm like, I wouldn't say entertain, because I think entertain is a completely like different ball game. I'm saying like intrigued, interested. Like what keeps them watching it? So I mean, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
From a directing and a writing standpoint, I would always say character.
Yeah.
If you have compelling characters and you have people that either the audience can relate to or empathize with on a certain level, or like understand motivation, you know like why they're doing what they're doing, or on the flip side, it's very well done where you don't know why they're doing what they're doing. You want to know how their actions pay off. And it's something that we always talk about when we make movies and when we write, is this idea of payoff, that you have a character and you have them going through this struggle throughout an entire movie, and you get to see how all of their actions pay off. And I think that is one of the biggest things for a director and a writer to actually encapsulate in a film and do a really good job with. And that will hold an audience if you have a character where their actions as they go through have a payoff at the end.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think it is kind of that idea of like kind of seeing it to the end, and seeing what the payoff is. And I guess, part of it is like, oh, well, part of the journey is the end. But part of the journey is also the journey. And I think that, Denis Villeneuve specifically, like when I watch his films, and I've been rewatching some of his catalog, and there's still some movies in his catalog, especially his earlier films, I want to see. But he has this way, and he's very similar to Nolan, Christopher Nolan in that regard, of he's completely ambiguous when the movie first begins. And he just kind of plops you down into these scenarios. But it's not the same as like, there's no sense of familiarity. And I think the reason that there's no sense of familiarity is because the characters are placed in very unfamiliar situations. I think that is like the key to making it intriguing and interesting, is if your characters mirror the same experience as your audience. And like,
yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up, that even as I look over his catalog, and like you said, we've seen a lot of his more recent films, especially, and very knowledgeable of his more recent films, but not a whole lot of his earlier films. And I actually just saw on Amazon Prime, Polytechnique is available to watch and stream for free on Amazon Prime. But he does a really good job in all of his especially recent movies, where the character is just immediately dropped into these situations that they have no idea what's happening. That from the forefront of an audience perspective, it looks like just another day for the character in pretty much all of his films. You know, you talk about Sicario, you talk about Enemy, you talk about Arrival, even Blade Runner 2049, where like the world is super expansive, but Officer K is just kind of doing his thing that he normally does. All of those films, your character is just doing what they're doing, and then something happens within the first couple of minutes that completely changes that.
Yeah.
And that's something that you learn in screenwriting books and screenwriting lessons, and when you're learning how to craft a story, that's kind of like a textbook thing to do. But once you nail it perfectly, that you have this character in this world and they're just going about their daily life, and what you're about to see is not just another day in their life, that creates that feeling that this movie that you're about to watch is a really special event.
And I think like he really messes with the pacing of exposition, because he doesn't give you everything right at the beginning. Like he definitely, like I was thinking of Sicario, with Emily Blunt's character. You know, you're like, okay, she's part of the DEA, FBI, something. I think it was FBI, right? She's doing this raid, and then all of a sudden there's bodies in the wall, and you're just like, and she's confused. You know, you're confused. It's not one of those moments where they're like, oh yeah, this is normal business. Like, this is just what the cartel's doing. She's completely taken aback. And then the bomb goes off, and it's just, I didn't need to know anything about her character. And then as you progress through the story and you see her decisions, and really her reaction to other people's decisions, then you gain an understanding of her character. I think that is like something that not a lot of filmmakers do. And I know in like film class and stuff, we talk about it all the time, where it's like, oh, well, you just have to make it so that, you know, you don't give a lot of exposition, but you inherently give a lot of exposition. It's just kind of something that you do inherently. So it's very interesting to see Villeneuve, like this amazing director who just has a way of kind of pushing you into the maze without you realizing that's the entrance.
It's a really good point that you brought up, that we're getting slightly off topic, but it's something that we really need to cover when we talk about Villeneuve, especially in this regard of just dropping your characters into a situation and your audience learning a whole lot in a very short amount of time about the world that these characters live in. And the film that we're actually working on, that's now in post-production, I, as the editor, was actually making a whole lot of notes about what the characters learn through pretty much every scene and what the audience learns pretty much through every scene. And my notes for the first 10 minutes, not even 5 minutes, probably even 2 minutes, because it's a long short, but very, very beginning of the film, before I even had one line down on what the main character learns, I had 10 lines down on what the audience learns. Because both through story and through character, we did a really good job of showing that world that the main character lives in. And the audience is immediately thrown into everything that they need to know for the story to progress. They don't know the whole story in the first 2 minutes, but they know the foundation of what the character is living in and what the situation is, so that the story can continue and twist and turn and still be thrown curveballs, but understand the world that the characters live in. And that's something that Villeneuve does perfectly. And we talked about this a little bit last week too, about this idea of adapted screenplays, or not even adapted screenplays, but directors who don't write their own screenplays, and pitfalls that you might be able to run into, things that you might fall into a little bit when you don't inherently write the screenplay and you just direct it. And we talked about a couple of directors the other day that might not have that directorial voice that they want to, that in these films it's more dictated by either the cinematographer or the production design or just the story itself, and the director is just kind of showing action where the other pieces of it are taking more credit almost for the film than the actual director. Villeneuve doesn't do that. Villeneuve, throughout all of his films, establishes such a solid style, presence, and narrative technique, even though he hasn't written the screenplay. And I always thought that that was something that was so cool. We both watched Skyfall, which is a fantastic film, but Skyfall is definitely more of like a Roger Deakins movie than a Sam Mendes movie. It just feels like another Bond movie with a lot of style, but Sam Mendes doesn't have as much of a footprint in it as he probably could, and it turns into more of the cinematographer's movie and a James Bond movie rather than a Sam Mendes movie. And that was like my first real conscious decision to say that, you know, sometimes directors that don't write their screenplays actually might fall a little bit to other members of the team. But Villeneuve doesn't do that. He definitely has that style that permeates everything.
And it's weird because
you know that he's directing it.
It's weird because like the last film, so he's writing the Dune movies, plural, because there's going to be like 2 of them. And they're going to come out, I think one slated for at the end of this year, but honestly with the film industry where it is, who knows? So it could be next year. But he's writing those, but again, those are adapted screenplays from a book. And then I don't think he's written a single film, a feature film that's, you know, had really great commercial success since Incendies and Polytechnic, I believe. I think he's only I think everything else has been taking other people's screenplays, which is crazy because all the films between Incendies and Dune have been the ones that have put him on the map. And brought him commercial success, which is awesome. I have like so much, as someone who loves to direct but hates writing, because I always think that I can write and do a really good job with it, and then I fall into potholes and pitfalls on every turn. Can't connect characters, can't come up with endings, missing pieces, and it just gets so frustrating for me. And so I really enjoy reading like your screenplays and thinking about as a director, like what I would do with that. But to do it multiple times and have those movies where you didn't write the screenplay be the ones that actually go up for Academy Awards and become, you know, critical successes, that's awesome. Because you think of writer-directors that do that, like Coen brothers and Quentin Tarantino and Christopher Nolan and, you know, all of those directors that have a hand in their own screenplays and then go on to obviously win a whole bunch of Academy Awards for something that it was their creative vision from the forefront. This is a director who now can work with a story that someone else has created and put it into such a stylistic, beautiful form that can then not only be attractive to audiences, but also be attractive to critics and the Academy and award season as well. Like it's just awesome. And it is, so congrats to you, Denny. You get our applause from the Backlight podcast. We're gonna mail it.
20-year-olds sitting here that 21 and 20-year-olds sitting here that really have never made a feature before, but we're like, congrats, Denny, you did it.
You're really getting up there, man. You're getting some success. Congrats, dude. God. But yeah, I think it's really cool the way I always like to meta theme directors as if they're like a film in themselves. Like Tarantino is essentially a film encyclopedia. If you just watch his catalog, then you'll get an experience of you'll experience the history of film. If you just watch everything that he's made. Nolan, I always think, is the man of dreams and time travel, and he's just able to traverse the two with his intercutting, just like a master at his craft, and because he truly is one. And then Denny is, to me, he's the man of mazes. You know, he just knows how to work and cultivate ambiguity to an extent that doesn't alienate the viewer, and that doesn't confuse them. And I think with Mazes, I guess that brings us kind of full circle to
Right to Prisoners.
Yeah, Right to Prisoners. So Prisoners was his 2013 film. I believe he made 2 films in 2013. Enemy was his other one.
He did.
Yes. But this was it's an American thriller. It was written by Aaron Gizikowski. Stars Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, Mary Bello, Terrence Howard, Melissa Leo, Paul Dano. Very big cast of some great actors that put in some freaking brilliant performances. And also, this was Villeneuve's first English language feature film, which is also interesting. Yeah, because Incendies and Polytechnic were both in French. What did you think of Prisoners? Just as like a film out of outside the academic viewpoint, just as a viewer.
I liked it.
Well, there you go, guys. All right, thanks. Come back next week for episode 3.
Perfect. No, I really like this movie, and this was I had watched this for the first time 2 years ago or so, and it was one of the first movies that had such deep-rooted symbolism that I had really been akin to. This idea of having super thematic symbols and motifs throughout the entire story that encapsulate not only the actual narrative, but all the characters as well and what they're going through. And it was the first time that I had seen that in a film so very well done and crafted. I hadn't really seen a movie before that had this much symbolism put into it and was able to put it into one really nice, complete package. It also kind of lands off at an ending that, like, you don't necessarily know what's about to happen afterwards, but does it with intention. Like, it's just a great film. And obviously all the performances, like we said, Hugh Jackman is fantastic. Paul Dano is really good. Man of few words, but is really good at being the character that he plays. Of Alex Jones, and then Jake Gyllenhaal, who has some ups and down moments in his career, is an amazing Detective Loki in this film as well. And Jake Gyllenhaal was in Villeneuve's other 2013 movie, Enemy, which I like significantly less than Prisoners.
Yeah.
But the quality of Jake Gyllenhaal's acting between the two movies is just leaps and bounds. I love him in Prisoners.
Yeah. To me, he's a completely underrated actor. What's crazy about Jake Gyllenhaal is I see him traverse different directors, and yet still puts in the same quality of performance, but still has like different levels of nuance. Like going from Sam Mendes' Jarhead to David Ayer's End of Watch to playing Mysterio in Spider-Man, or playing a Detective Loki, and then Adam and Anthony in Enemy. It's just like the guy is just a great actor. And then Nightcrawler was his next feature right after both of those. Jeez.
Which, like, he went from person trying to help other people to playing two different people of the same person to one of the modern films, like, most coveted anti-hero, like, all within a year.
It's funny, and
that's like that's awesome.
It's like a gradient, him Prisoners. He's like this like good detective who's slightly flawed, and an Enemy, he's like a good guy, but then he meets his twin who's like not so much of a good guy, and then he just traverses into the full not good guy in Nightcrawler. So there you go. Enemy is what made it so that Jake Gyllenhaal is a good actor.
We love you, Jake Gyllenhaal. Once again, you get our 20-year-old seal of approval of doing it. You did it.
Yep. I include soundbite of audience applause there. There you go.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yep. So I would say Prisoners is probably the best crime thriller I've seen that with a sense of continuity and a sense of constantly building tension. I think that is the most remarkable point about Prisoners that I enjoy as a viewer was its slow burn. It's a slow burn. It's like a 2.5 hour movie. But by God, is it just like one long building anxiety attack? And a lot of that's owed to one, Villeneuve, because he was able to craft that vision. Two, Roger Deakins, because then he was able to visualize that vision. Three, Johan Johansson, for able to audiate that tension. And then the actors who were able to develop that tension as characters. And it just all works so well together. It's one of those movies I walk out of every time I watch it and I go, well, I don't walk out of, I just stand up from my couch. And I go, there's like nothing wrong with that movie. Like it's damn near perfect. Like I can't find any flaws. Every time I'm like, oh, the story could have been a bit clearer. And I'm like, no, it couldn't have. It's really as clear as it needs to be. And when I think of like crafting characters, I think Villeneuve, he's kind of like the guy of less is more. You know, he doesn't build characters that are like unnecessarily complex. I look at Loki and I look at Dover, which is Jake Gyllenhaal and Hugh Jackman's characters respectively. And you know, they are very archetypal. You know, they fit into little boxes. And I think by doing that, he's able to kind of push them outside those boxes and confuse the viewer, and kind of manipulate where they think the story's going. You know, the minute you meet Loki, it's like a guy that's paying attention to all the details, and he says, "Oh, I've solved 100% of my cases." It's like, okay, well, this guy's a perfectionist. He's a very good detective, and then you watch him just really suck at this case. And you see Dover, who's like this man who says to his son in the beginning of the film, like, you know, you got to take care of yourself. And, you know, you're the line between the outside world and your family is what it comes down to. You have to protect them. And then you watch the movie and he really can't protect them. And you see him just slowly disintegrate. And by putting people in boxes, by kind of putting people in mazes from the beginning, you kind of see them unravel themselves as they try and escape it. And God, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
You brought up the first point of the movie, Hugh Jackman and his son, which I can't remember his son's name, Ralph, played by Dylan Minnette, who was in 13 Reasons Why. It's like the best movie or show that I can put him into. But it's okay. He does well in Prisoners because, you know, he's trying to take care of his family. But the other thing that Hugh Jackman says, and the piece of Hugh Jackman's character that I really loved, was being prepared for anything. He's got the whole like nuclear bomb out shelter in his basement. He like tells his son at the very beginning, like, you have to be prepared for everything, and then is not prepared for this, has no idea what to do or how to do it or anything like that, and thinks that how he's going about it is the proper way. And that brings us back to the mazes really well. Spoiler alert, by the way, for anyone who hasn't seen this movie, you should probably go watch it before you listen any further to the rest of the podcast.
It came out
we're going to spoil the crap out of this movie.
7 years ago. 7 years. Go watch it.
Go watch it. Press pause. We'll give you a second to press pause.
Yeah. All right, cool. You press pause. Congratulations.
All right, cool. You've watched the movie, and now you're going to... Okay, you understand now. Okay, cool. So
we can put it on in the background if you want.
Oh, perfect. The movie goes to this point of mazes being kind of like the final piece of this giant puzzle that you need to figure out where Hugh Jackman and Terrence Malick's children are. And the person who's keeping them captive is obsessed with mazes. And it's this whole point of red herrings and throwing you a curveball as an audience member watching this of where you think you're supposed to be going, where you think you're supposed to be headed to find the kids, and it's completely in the wrong direction. But every single character, whether it be Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, Hugh Jackman's wife, played by Maria Bello, any of the characters, Hugh Jackman thinks that locking Paul Dano up is the best way to get to his kids. Maria Bello thinks that sitting in sorrow and relying on her husband is how she's going to get her kids back. Jake Gyllenhaal thinks that knocking on doors and playing it cool is going to help him figure out the end of this mystery. And they all kind of take a different entranceway into this maze and take different turns because they think that they're going to get to the center point of this maze or the exit the way that they know how. And the whole point of the ending or semi-ending of Prisoners is that the people that were holding their daughters captive were given a book of mazes and told, you leave when you finish the last maze. And the last maze is an unfinishable maze. So the kids are trapped there, never able to leave, never able to finish this maze. And it's kind of just a little piece of what everyone else has been going through as well, that this is almost like an unfinishable maze. They can't find the ending through the way that they know how. Hugh Jackman ultimately figures it out, but doesn't have a happy ending in the end. You know, he doesn't get what he wants. He doesn't get his child, and he doesn't get a normal life after that. He's thrown in a hole. Jake Gyllenhaal never figures it out. And it's just kind of like they all reach that maze at the end where it's unfinishable. You can't solve it. And if you do solve it, it's not rewarding. You know, when you figure out that it's an unsolvable maze, it's not rewarding. It's not like, oh man, like I want to be able to finish this, and you can't.
And I think like Villeneuve does that in his film meta cinematically as well. You know, this, I think Gierskowski wrote it based off an Edgar Allan Poe poem, if I remember. The Telltale Heart. That's what Gierskowski partially was inspired by. And Edgar Allan Poe is a mystery writer. As in, you know, you have the likes of Agatha Christie, you have the Sherlock Holmes series and everything, and it's those kind of mysteries pervade cinema. All the tropes are constantly hit in every single piece of mystery, and Prisoners does a good job at hitting those tropes, but they hit them so that the audience is satisfied from a narrative point, but then they're perverted and altered and changed so that they line up with the narrative to kind of frustrate the viewer at the same time. You know, when we first meet Paul Dano and we see everything that's happening, you think you have it figured out. You're like, well, he must be the bad guy because he's this weirdo. He's like, doesn't say a lot. He's probably on the spectrum somewhere. And he just fits the archetype of child molester, of someone who's gone off the rails. And after like the first 30 minutes, you're like, oh, well, this isn't going anywhere. And just when you're starting to get tired of this, of going down this route, just when you're in the maze as a viewer and you're like hitting that brick wall and you're like, oh, well, I can't go out this way, he presents another option for you to look at. And that's Bobby Taylor, which is played by the ever scary and frightening and just weird David Dastmalchian. He if you want to see him in a comedic role, he plays like this Russian Ukrainian not mobster dude, but like criminal in Ant-Man series, which is great. But he's also plays the Joker cultists in both the Gotham series on Fox as well as The Dark Knight. And he is presented as this like, oh my God, it has to be this guy. You know, he's just a creep. His house he was at the candlelight vigil, and, you know, he runs from the scene. And we all know that you only run from something if you're guilty. And then you go to his house and it's covered in mazes. He has all these boxes filled with children's clothing and these snakes everywhere. And he's just a creep. And then he's obsessed with mazes. And you're like, it has to be this guy. Everyone's convinced it's this guy. Jake Gyllenhaal is convinced it's this guy. Dover, Hugh Jackman, he's convinced that it's this guy. Because Paul Dano wasn't seemingly working. Hugh Jackman's still pretty convinced that Paul Dano knows where his kids are because he said that thing to him in the car park. But Bobby Taylor's uses that second route through the maze where you're like, all right, it has to be this one. And then you go down that and you realize that was just a red herring and that the actual way through the maze was kind of shown to you in the very beginning. And you slowly put the puzzle pieces together and you kind of figure it out. And that's what I love about Villeneuve is that he takes the ambiguity and the frustrations that come with mazes, and then he manages to convey that to the audience, not only through his characters but through the way he constructs a narrative. He does that in Arrival, he does it in Enemy, he does it in Sicario, and not only does that create a sense of anxiety, but it keeps the interest. Kind of getting back to that first question, is it keeps the viewer intrigued and constantly wanting to watch, and it improves the pacing.
Yeah. There are two things that you learn as a screenwriter pretty quickly, or even as like a film goer or director or anything, is that you could either give your audience a piece of the puzzle and just keep giving them pieces, and then you find where the piece fits and then you get another piece, or you show them the whole puzzle and you say put it all together. And in the case of Enemy or Arrival, you keep getting pieces. And you keep getting, here's this piece. Oh, it fits in this way. You get this piece. It fits in this way. So that when you see the whole puzzle at the end, you're like, oh, I get it. With Prisoners, you get the whole puzzle. You see the grandma of
Are you talking about the auntie?
Alex Jones.
Yeah.
You see Alex Jones's guardian. You see Bob Taylor, halfway through Act 2. You see all of the suspects. You see all of the ways through the maze. You see the whole maze, and you get to look at every turn and every entrance. And he crafts it so that you see this whole picture. You see everyone involved, and then it depends on which turns you take to get to the end there. It depends on which puzzle piece you put down to get to the full puzzle. I always love that analogy of using the puzzle because it definitely shows two ways to craft a movie. And two ways for your audience to be entertained. Some people make puzzles literally going piece by piece and trying to find where it fits, or some people study the picture on the box and then make the perimeter of it and then fill it in piece by piece. And so that is always like how you can compare kind of like structure and framework of movies, that how your character goes through these actions and how you as an audience member get to see these actions. A lot of the time, movies with multiple perspectives, where you get to see Hugh Jackman's perspective while you also see Jake Gyllenhaal's perspective, and you also get to see Grace Dover's perspective. You get to see all of those multiple perspectives. TV shows do this a lot. In that case, you get the big puzzle, and you get to see what everything is, and then you just kind of have to fill in the blanks like that. And that's one way to do it. A lot of the time when you have a closed perspective film where it's one character and you're just following them along on this journey, you get the puzzle pieces piece by piece.
Yeah.
And I think that doing it this way, where you see the whole maze and you see the whole puzzle, fits super meta, like you had said, into the themes and the symbolism and motifs of this movie, with it being focused around mazes and that being like the ultimate theme when it comes to the end of this film. Doing it that way, where you construct it, you have multiple perspectives, you have multiple corners of the puzzle, and the big picture of what it's supposed to look like in the end, you see everything, but then you just have to put it together through all of these different perspectives.
I mean, I love that. I remember when I first watched it, I didn't catch, I caught it, but I didn't catch it very well. The whole thing with the priest in the beginning and the body in his basement, basically, just so that if you've watched it, because you better have watched it by now. It's been 7 years. basically Jake Gyllenhaal, the girls get abducted, and he's like, I'm going to check all the registered sex offenders in the area. And he goes to this priest's, and he finds him like unconscious, and then he's like searching the house. He's unconscious because the priest is drunk. But in his basement is this dead body that he finds. And it's got a little maze. It's the insignia of basically the film. It's got this maze on it around his neck. And you're kind of like, okay, this is weird. Like, I don't know what it is. And the guy, the priest, is like, he asked me to strap him up and like tie him to this chair and leave him in the basement. And he was trying to confess his sins and that he had been abducted. He's abducted over 30 kids and stuff. And you're like, oh, okay, well, he's dead. So it's a dead end, literally. And I think that is like, honestly, that's the first route down the maze, and you come across a literal dead end, and he's like, we'll go back the other way. And then you realize that like that dead end explains literally everything. But what I love is it's not dramatic irony there. It's not like this case of, oh, okay, the viewer knows more than the characters. It's only when Loki has his meltdown and looks down at the pictures that you put two and two together, just as he's putting two and two together. And I think that when the actions of the characters and the understandings of the characters mirrors the audience, it's like you're on a roller coaster ride. Like you are just it's when the mentality of the viewer and the mentality of the world of the film that you're watching become one. And that's when I find film the most enjoyable of experiences, is when I completely move my identity and everything that I know to be true into that film. That's why I love Nolan films, because he does the same thing. And I think that they're very, I mean, hey, maybe episode 27 down the road we'll do like a Nolan Villeneuve comparison. But they do a great job and a very similar job at making it so that the viewer is completely enthralled and completely engrossed in their films. One thing that I briefly wanted to talk about really quick, if I pull it up, was it was a comment that I saw on the film. It was a review. And I just want to like talk about it because I thought it was interesting. If I can find it again, if it would load. Is it gonna show me it? Hold on, give me a second. It was basically saying that it was like Prisoners is just a mess of masculinity, and that it doesn't have like a lot. Like Hugh Jackman isn't very good, and that it's just kind of this mess of over masculine characters and tropes like that. And like I chewed on it for a bit, and I can understand kind of where they're coming from, because I'll give Villeneuve his due diligence in that basically he really doesn't handle a female character well until Arrival. I know he handles them well in Incendies and Polytechnic, but I think when he first entered the English speaking feature films, I think Enemy is a movie about masculinity. Prisoners, basically, Miss Dover is in a drug infused sleep the entire time, and then Viola Davis shows up, tries to like help out, I guess, unleashes Paul Dano, who nearly kills them all, and then cries. And I do think that like the women of the film are not given a lot to chew on, but I feel like that is like the point of the film. I think it does address like the role of, because I think that's the greatest irony, is that it's the role, like now I'm just in Revelation. Is that the role of the man in life, in humanity and society, is that he's supposed to protect us, that he is supposed to be able to be prepared for everything and such. And the only person who's really prepared for everything is the antagonist, who's the auntie, who is a woman, and she's the only one who kind of is able to traverse all of the trials and tribulations that the male protagonists throw at her. So kind of once I think about that, it's actually a correct comment, but in the wrong vein. It's actually a compliment. So great job.
once again, you get our seal of approval. Yeah, you mentioned that, and it's a really good point. And I had kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, that Miss Dover, as she's in her drugged up state at the very beginning of the movie, she's still heavy grieving about losing her daughter and losing Viola Davis's daughter. And she sits there and she's on the bed and she's like hitting Hugh Jackman. She goes, "You were supposed to protect us from everything. You said that you would protect us from everything." And that's something that, you know, the traditional man of the house person is supposed to do. It's supposed to always be the man of the house protecting the family from everything. You see him hunt at the beginning. You see him tell his son in like man-to-man talk of like, you have to be prepared for everything because you're going to have your own family and you have to protect them one day. And Hugh Jackman does a great job of showing that character, that person of the traditional masculine trope of my family's in danger. So I'm going to do everything I can to protect them and bring them back together. Everything I can. Doesn't matter if it's morally right. Doesn't matter if I think it's the perfect route. It's what I can do to bring them back together. Yeah. And so I totally agree with that comment a little bit, that this is 100% an exploration of masculinity. And it's really funny that Enemy and Prisoners come out at the same time, because they both kind of deal with that same theme. It's not as prevalent as mazes or religion in this film, but it's definitely something that's buried in there and is conscious. It wasn't an accident to do something like that. And then his next two movies after Prisoners and Enemy are Arrival and Sicario. Which Emily Blunt and Amy Adams as the two main leads of those films, and dealing with how they can pretty much do anything. You know, it's a very modern look at the FBI agent and the scientist in its most basic form of going forth and like breaking down those roles that Emily Blunt is just surrounded by a whole bunch of men in the FBI department. And, you know, she has to listen to them and she has to do what Josh Brolin and, not Guillermo del Toro, but his son.
Del Toro.
Yes. Thank you. She has to listen and do what they tell her to do, or else she leaves the job. And in Arrival, she's a scientist, which is normally, you know, like Jeremy Renner's character, or she's being bossed around by the military. And she is the ultimate one that no matter what, she's going to get the job done her way. And so it's really, really funny, not funny, but interesting that, you know, these two movies, Prisoners and Enemy, deal with a whole lot of fragile masculinity or traditional masculinity. And then the next two movies to come out are hard-hitting movies with female leads that show that, you know, women can do it too. And so once again, seal of approval, just an awesome, you know, queue of movies that go in order by release date that really tackle those elements really, really well.
Yeah, it's funny because like I think before Prisoners, he did it. He must like constantly bounce between the two. Yeah, because he must because Incendies and Polytechnic is female leads. Prisoners and Enemy are male leads. Then Arrival and Sicario are female leads. And then Blade Runner and Dune are male leads.
And then Cleopatra's in pre-production to come after that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And so, he's literally just in a cycle, which is cool. I think
that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting point that I feel like we just discovered ourselves just now. But it is a very cool thing to look at, like the trend of masculinity and femininity across his pieces. And
they're not in your face.
Yeah, it's not in your face. That's what I love. Yeah.
It's not a whole movie about masculinity or not a whole movie about female struggle or the power of the woman. It's nuanced. And it's something that when you look at it and you watch a movie for a second or third time, you can pick up on. Arrival and Sicario are a little bit more, upfront about the men of society kind of suppressing what the women are saying. But it's a very nuanced theme that really hits home when you think about it, especially in Blade Runner 2049, that the main thing holding Officer K back from his revelation is the Dream Maker, who is played by a woman. And it's just, you don't know that her relevance to the story is going to be as big as it actually becomes at that point. And she is the only thing that keeps Officer K from finding out the actual truth of who he is. So, wow, I didn't know that either. I didn't recognize that. That's awesome. Look at that, making revelations here live on the podcast.
So, and you brought up a point about like his nuance and how Villeneuve really is an interface. And Prisoners kind of poses a question as well, is like, how much should your film convey thematic material? Like, how much is too much theme? How much is too little? And I think that's like a really interesting question, because there are movies that do both, that have way too much theme, and then movies that have no theme at all, and so I just don't care about watching them.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this. And it was only really until we started talking movies with our first film that theme and framework were really at the forefront of my mind in terms of movies.
Oh, by the way, you can watch our first film on our channel, so go ahead and watch that. Yep,
it's live. Go watch it. It's pretty good.
Okay.
So I watched The Lighthouse as my thing that I watched, or one of the things that I watched between last week and this week. And that movie is so heavy-handed in its theme. The entire movie is its theme. It doesn't really have a whole lot of narrative structure, but that's, the story is that it's just a Promethean character cloaked in this environment of the lighthouse. And then it's a huge masculine struggle where the thing that they live in looks like a pretty phallic and crude version of a penis. Whoa. And it's Willem Dafoe. Yeah, I know. And then it's Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson just fighting back and forth about who's the bigger man and who's a dog. And if you miss the thematic elements of the film, like I did on first watch, it just becomes a confusing watch experience. A movie like 1917, like we talked about last week, isn't as heavily rooted in theme. It's still a fantastic film, but it's not as heavy-handed in its thematic material. It is the main theme is, the power of one person, obviously, but it's very much a narrative film. You follow the character, go on their journey, get to their destination, call off the attack, and then live. And it's a war movie in that regard, like that. But it doesn't become any less of a viewing experience. You just kind of afterwards get to sit and say, okay, I'm glad that I got to see him go on that journey. I am very happy that he succeeded. He lost someone, so it might not be a true victory, but the thought-provoking elements in terms of the deeper narrative of 1917 become a little bit more limited because there isn't as much thematic and symbolic elements to talk about. Movies like Parasite, movies like Prisoners, movies like Blade Runner 2049 and Sicario and Arrivals. Oh my God, I love Arrival. They aren't as heavy-handed as a movie like The Lighthouse, but just have the perfect amount of symbolism, nuance, and thematic material that we've watched these movies multiple times, all of Villeneuve's, modern catalog, and we're still finding out about more thematic elements in his films. And it invokes further discussion about why the film was made, how the film was made, and what makes Villeneuve an amazing director is that there's levels to the thematic elements, huge amounts of levels, but it's not so heavy-handed in the fact that you get wrapped up in the theme that you forget about the story.
I think it comes down to the fact that like Villeneuve, like Nolan, and like a lot of the directors and writers and filmmakers that we love, he has a framework. to his movies. And framework is it's a term that I haven't really heard many other film people use it. I guess like I just kind of made it up, and then like we started talking about it and developed it, and then you were like, yeah, I'm gonna use it for like this app design thing, which you should go check out on Mike's graphics Instagram.
At Sorba_design, if you're interested and you want to hire me as a motion designer, I'm open.
Yeah. We're all open. We're all unemployed. But a framework is this idea of it's how you construct your story and your movie on the meta scale. Not about like, oh, what's my plot circle? What's my pet the kitty? Not pet the kitty. That's a music term. What's my save the cat? There you go. What's going to be my through line that keeps my plot together? That's not what framework's about. Framework is about how elements of style, how elements of narrative, how elements of theme, and how elements of is that the three? Yeah, no, it's story, theme, and I guess character, but I always put that kind of more on the narrative side. Narrative is story and character. You have your theme, and then you have your style. How those three things cultivate to a meta cinematic experience. And I think that Villeneuve has such a nuanced style that is about ambiguity, that is about mazes, that is about not giving your viewer everything at first sight and at first glance, but provoking thought into the smaller details and into the things that you don't think matter. And then having a narrative that reflects that and that embodies that through characters that are lost, that seemingly believe themselves to be found, but are in fact just as lost as anyone else. A story that continuously throws red herrings your way and moves you into a maze of a narrative. And then a theme about kind of the lost sense or the kind of ambiguous sense of masculinity, and how that pervades families and pervades society, but actually doesn't do anything. And whether it's kind of more of a period piece. But what I love is that the theme reflects the very framework that he's fabricating, which is that it's not clear cut, that it's not something that's black and white. It's not like a Pixar movie, Pixar movies are great. They're I always think that they're one of the best things to look at frameworks because they do it very well of theme, story, and style. If you think of Pixar movie, you just have this feeling, this kind of cinema feeling that comes about you. And every time you watch one, you end up leaving the theater with that kind of feeling. And that's a Pixar framework. Villeneuve has managed to craft his own sort of framework, his own sort of experience of when I watch Sicario, when I watch Prisoners, when I watch Arrival, I have that same perplexing sense of understanding because I feel like I've learned something, but I don't know what I've learned. And I feel like I solved the case. I feel like Loki at the end of the film, where it's like, I feel like I solved something, but there's still a loose end. There's still something that I don't know. And I think that that's what makes Villeneuve and what's make Prisoners such a great experience is because he's able to craft such a deliberate and well-conceived framework. And kind of, I think it would be good to link back to our first episode. We talked about the ending of Extraction, and let's talk about the ending of Prisoners, and why I would say the ending of Prisoners and Extraction are in the same, are very ambiguous. Both of them are ambiguous, but I feel that Prisoners actually gives you the answers throughout the entire film, whereas Extraction leaves you on a loose end.
Yeah. It's something that I talked about in last episode is the idea of intentionality with your ending. We've talked about this with the screenplay that I was writing, that you craft these characters, you craft their journey, you know where they're going, you know where they've been, you know what their actions will do to come to a conclusion. And if you decide to make it an ambiguous ending, which is great, it's intentional, that you know where the ending might actually go as a director or a screenwriter, but it's not necessarily shown for the audience to see, or it's not so unintentional, So Extraction, we talked about its unintentionality. We talked about how it may or may not be Chris Hemsworth based on audience reaction. and the ability to have a sequel, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And that leaves most of the actions of the ending of the movie and some of the actions in the middle of the movie to be debated as to whether or not they're actually relevant or as impactful as we might have thought. With Prisoners, it ends with Hugh Jackman falling in a hole, finding his daughter's safety whistle, and Jake Gyllenhaal finally putting the pieces together a little bit too late, and stumbling upon the aunt's house, and he hears the safety whistle from somewhere beyond. Like, he doesn't know where the whistle is coming from. I think that this is a fantastic ending because where everyone is. You don't necessarily know if Jake Gyllenhaal is going to go and save him, but you do know that they're going to reconnect somehow. You know the situation that they're both in, and you can formulate what might happen next, and it could very well be along the lines of what Villeneuve had expected you to do. It wasn't an accident that the ending lands like that.
It feels intended. It's the intention. It's
the perfect word to describe it, is that you have an ending that one fits with your characters and what we talked about earlier, your character's journey. You've been intrigued with them to see where they go and the actions that they take. And now you're at this ending point where their actions have led them to this point. And now you get to see or not see where it goes from here. And I think that that's really special. And what makes the ending of this so great is you might have expected either Jake Gyllenhaal to solve the case or Hugh Jackman to solve the case. And Hugh Jackman ends up in a hole, and Jake Gyllenhaal ends up totally confused and hopeless and kind of on a lead, but it's obviously too late. And so both of your characters have lost dramatically, but they've also both found out what they were searching for. Hugh Jackman found out who was keeping his kids, and Jake Gyllenhaal found out the similar thing, but has kind of put his pieces together in a different way, and they both ended up at the same point. You don't see what happens to both of them, but you know that their journey has both been conclusive but very unsatisfying. And we finished off Extraction the same way last week, with satisfying versus unsatisfying and expected versus unexpected. This is very much I would say that it's satisfying but very unexpected, especially for a crime thriller like this one, that they have gone to a conclusion. They have seen the ending of their journey, and it's satisfying in that regard. Or it's the other way. It might be expected and unsatisfying, in all honesty. It's not both satisfying and expected or unsatisfying and unexpected. It is one flip of the two, where you've seen the end of their journey, but you're not happy with how they got to that point and the results of their efforts.
And just to those who kind of, when we talk about satisfying and satisfaction and expectation, it's always like the two things that you have to measure, or at least the two things that we measure as filmmakers for crafting endings, and also evaluating endings, is, did it match your level of satisfaction, and did it match your expectation? And most oftentimes the best movies are those that are satisfyingly unexpected, or unsatisfyingly expectedly unsatisfying. There's a lot of nihilist pieces, No Not Children of Men, No Country for Old Men, the other one with men and a C word. No Country for Old Men. That movie has a expectedly unsatisfying ending. You have your protagonist die, but it's alluded to. It's constantly moving towards that end, and so that's why it's expected, but it's unsatisfying. So, because if it had a weird, come out of right field, just this weird, almost like a deceptive ending where it's like, oh, everything worked out, bad guy dies, and it wouldn't feel right because it doesn't match the rest of the film.
1917 is a really good example of an ending that's expected but unsatisfying, because you obviously expect your protagonist to get to his endpoint, call off the attack. Otherwise, following him on this journey would pretty much be pointless. But then it's unsatisfying because his friend and Blake's brother is dead.
Yeah.
And he's alone on this 2-man journey, and you don't know what's about to happen next. And so you're very unsatisfied with how the character gets to that point, but you know that he was going to get there.
And we're not saying like you walk with like unsatisfying endings, you know, like you storm out the theater and you're like, God, what was that garbage? No, that's only if you watch Rise of Skywalker. That's the only time that happens. God, I hate that movie. Anyway, but Prisoners is such a good balance of, as you said, it's unexpectedly satisfying because I love it because it satisfies, to me, satisfaction comes with character, and it satisfies every single character's movement towards who they are. Jake Gyllenhaal's Loki is a guy who solves 100% of his cases, and at first you hear the whistle, and what I love, it never cuts to Hugh Jackman. It just stays on Jake Gyllenhaal, and you're like, I don't know what that sound was. And then you're kind of putting two together when it's like, oh, she never, like, the whistle that the girl had in the hospital is one that they bought. So she actually did find it back at the house. And you hear it again, and he's like, what the heck is that noise? And you realize that Hugh Jackman is doing what he was doing, which is surviving the literal fundamental of his character. And Jake Gyllenhaal looks towards the car, and it just holds on him looking. And it holds on him almost realizing of where he is, where Hugh Jackman's Dover is, and what's happening. But then it doesn't give you the ultimate satisfaction of resolving anything. And I think that is done because it ties in with the theme that is constantly put forward, which is, as you said, Mike, is that it's an unsolvable maze. If they gave you an ending, the movie wouldn't be a maze. It wouldn't fit into the framework that Villeneuve's established. My problem with Extraction's ending is that it's on a thread. It's not even on a framework. That movie works off a thread of a line, which is, oh, if you stay submerged, you only drown if you stay submerged. And to me, the movie doesn't reflect that theme. It's good to have thematic material in film, and especially in action films, because it does give a layer of like care and sympathy. But for the most part, no one cares. That's ultimately what it comes down. Action films, like if you're watching this and you're like, man, I really care about the little boy and Chris Hemsworth, you're not watching it for the right reasons. You shouldn't be like, you know, tearing up on every scene. You should be like, hell yeah, I'm just watching India get massacred. Whereas Prisoners, I've never cared about a movie so much to just watch people talk. Every time, the screenplay is just amazing. That is where all the conflict comes from, and where all the action comes from. Is when Jake Gyllenhaal and Hugh Jackman are having that conversation in the car, and then Jake Gyllenhaal starts reciting the alphabet, but it's like he's stuck on the letter A, as I said, when he's like freaking out. And he's like, hey, all right, I need you to calm down. I'm just like, but it's like, it's so great because I've never cared about the interactions between characters. The same with Paul Dano. Every time Hugh Jackman goes to Paul Dano's little prison, he's like, I'm just like, what's he gonna do? Like, what's gonna happen? When I first watched it, I was like, this guy's got to die at some point. But no one really dies in the movie. You know, you have a death in the beginning and they have a death at the end. So I think the ending of that film is a really good like look into how you should end crime thrillers, and then also how you should end films with regard to paying homage to what you've done throughout the rest of the film, and not just go for something left field. Like that's the problem with the Murder on the Orient Express. Is Murder on the Orient Express, you meet all these characters, and you're like, oh, you know, it must be this guy, this guy has reasonable motivations, and it's just like, well, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, or you know, and
it's been out for a couple of decades.
That basically it was everyone who committed the murder. They basically all take blame for it. And that's kind of like, you know, like it's a trope and it's part of the book and it's source material and stuff. But I remember when I watched the remake of the film with Kenneth Branagh, I just remember being like, I wish that they had done like I know it's the source material, but like it's such a cliche. It's cliche, but it's just so, it doesn't mean anything. That's my biggest problem. I love movies that have meaning.
It is unexpected and unsatisfying.
Yeah, which is honestly the worst, because then it's just left field and you're just like, blah. Yeah, that's God. So,
Well, I think
what? Yeah, go ahead.
on that,
Yeah.
we have definitely hit Denny very
I'm about to
well
say, are you going to
with
transition to
how he
Raj?
makes.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh God. Raj. He has a podcast now.
Oh,
It's great.
that's all.
And he's doing a 2-hour masterclass about his movies, and I'm very excited.
Dude, how many? You better take a shot for every time he shuffles with his hair.
Oh God.
Just be plastered by 10 minutes in. Hello, everyone. If you can't, oh well, you guys can't see me. It's not like if you can't see me, you can't see me. But I was shuffling my hair in humorous fashion.
Yeah, in famous Raj fashion. He's my idol. I love you. Put me on your podcast. I'd love to, or be on this podcast. Either one. If you happen to stumble across this podcast, reach out to us, please.
Please.
Anyway,
we're unemployed.
So it's a great segue into Roger Deakins for another podcast, definitely. But it's definitely a good conclusion for how Denny makes movies. And I feel like we talked about earlier, Prisoners is the perfect way to describe Denny's frameworks for most of his movies, if not all of them, is this idea of he's the maze builder. You get thrown into all of these just like another maze. You know, you flip the page and it's just another one. And then something happens and it throws you a curveball very early in the movie that this character that you think is just going about another day gets hit with this really wacky scenario that they didn't expect. And it's very well done because a lot of times that could be really weird and really awkward in a film or really cliche. And it's the perfect way to show that Denny really knows how to take an ordinary scenario and put a spin on it that makes the audience, makes the character, makes everything about it just an enjoyable experience. So we love you, Denny. Keep making more great movies. Very excited to see all of our favorite actors in Dune soon. I'm also getting the book soon so that I could read it before the movie comes out. So, recommendations.
Yes, let's talk about what we recommend to see and what, you know. Of course, leave comments, you know, about the podcast and stuff. We'll look at them in about 5 weeks when we finally release one. Also, just want to shout out to my brother Daniel, who is and Mike's very good friend because we're all friends. He is our kind of audio producer, so he's kind of we're recording this remotely for all those of you who didn't know that there's this pandemic going on. So we're having, so my brother's basically making it sound good and he's doing the music, so big shout out to him for all that. So we'll have to have him on the podcast to talk about music in film at some point.
He also has his own podcast, if you're interested, called The Scorekeepers. So go and listen to that.
Yes. We'll drop a link in the description for this episode.
Yeah.
So once we release this episode, so I would say for recommendations,
I have a really good one
that
I'll start off with, which I think will lead very nicely into tying up this week and leading into next week. Go and watch Sicario and Blade Runner 2049. If you haven't watched the first Blade Runner, then maybe not Blade Runner 2049. Watch the first one first.
Yeah, and make sure you watch the director's cut.
Yeah. Sicario is definitely my number one recommendation for next week. It is a fantastic film by Denis Villenueve and then Roger Deakins at the helm on camera and lights. And it's just a beautifully shot film with a great theme and a great message. Great. If you want to talk about cartel movies or like weird kind of war, but not really war movies, and like the difference between Extraction and an actual good one, definitely like Sicario is the better version of Extraction. In my opinion, by light years. So that's definitely mine. And then Blade Runner 2049 is another one. If you've seen the first Blade Runner, then go watch Blade Runner 2049 because it is absolutely fantastic.
Yes, I agree with all those. And if, as Mike said, if you haven't seen the first one, go watch the director's cut because that's the one that has the ending that actually lines up with 2049. And then once you watch the first one, actually look up like all the stuff that happened with the ending. It's very fascinating what happened with the ending of that film.
It is really fascinating.
I would say my recommendations, kind of linking into some future episodes. is go watch movies that are written, and this is off the same vein as you might, go watch movies that are written by Timothy Sheridan.
Timothy Chalamet?
Sorry. It's not Timothy Chalamet. Taylor Sheridan, not Timothy Sheridan. Taylor Sheridan. Jeez. I love that guy and I can't even remember his name. Yes, Taylor Sheridan. He is he was an actor. I think he still acts in like some series, but he's a writer. And he wrote Wind River, Hell or High Water, Sicario, and Sicario 2. And I would call him the pioneer of the neo-Western. He is just an amazing writer, and I've read 2 of his screenplays. I've read Wind River and Hell or High Water, and he just is able to craft tone in a screenplay, which is so weird because typically that's like the thing that most screenwriters avoid. But then again, he's been like nominated for Oscars for, his screenplays, and his movies are actually really good. So go watch them if you want to watch some really good Westerns that are beautifully acted, that look beautiful, that sound beautiful, because we care about sound on this podcast, and that are just great pieces of cinema. Go watch them. There's not many other pieces of neo-Westerns, and we'll talk about the neo-Western in a later podcast, because I know it's something that I want to create. I'm writing a feature right now, and then Mike is just like, I can see him like,
I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with neo-Westerns
foaming at the mouth
for some reason. They're just so good.
Mm-hmm.
And we will have an episode. We've been talking about like future episodes recently, and like how we want to keep the podcast going, and like I want to do a cinematography episode, and we want to do a neo-Western episode. And so definitely leave comments, especially when this one's posted, on which ones you guys want to see. We'll probably end up doing both, but any other future ones that you might want to see, comment, share, Facebook, MySpace, Google Plus, you name it,
Amazon.
Just throw it up. And
I don't know how you would do Amazon. Blackboard, YouTube. Oh wait, we are YouTube. God, never mind.
Yeah, we definitely are YouTube, but that's okay. Blackboard, definitely, dude. Hit us up on Blackboard. Give us some comments. RateMyProfessor.com.
Everything.
Yeah, seriously, rate us. Give us some ratings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. Leave some comments. Leave some likes. Do the whole thing. We appreciate all the feedback. We want to know what you guys want to listen to as much as what we want to talk about. And yeah. You got anything else, Pat?
No, I think that was a great podcast. Also, let us know if you guys want things shorter, longer. We could talk for hours, because we've literally talked for hours. So just let us know.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening to the Backlight Podcast, episode number 2. We'll be back next week with episode 3.